I guess I want to just kind of get an idea of growing up in southern Georgia. Kind of what was school like as a kid?
Oh, good question. Well, of course, as you know, I grew up in Americus, Georgia, Sumter County, which was a small rural community. Americus had about 13,000 people or so when I was there. School, interesting, I actually went to one of the last rural community schools. That was only had like 120 people in grades 1 through 7. It was, of course, all white at that point. Started school in '59 in the first grade and stayed there through the 7th grade when I started going in the city or the town. It's kind of exaggeration to call it a city. In the town where Americus, to the high school there, starting 8th grade, which is my first encounter with an integrated school, slightly integrated at that point. But it was a very, the elementary school was a very homogeneous rural community, and it was a great experience going to a small school where there was only one class per grade, and you knew everybody and everybody knew you. The city school was a little different. It was larger, certainly not big by your standards, the schools you went to, but a larger school, probably 450, 500 students. And that was where I first encountered going to school with people of other race. Mm-hmm. So there.
Was that, what was that kind of first experience? Like how, like I've always grown up with people from various racial, ethnic backgrounds. Like what was it kind of, that first initial thought, I guess?
Well, it was interesting because, of course, in the South in the 50s and 60s, you grew up with African-American people. I mean, there were no other ethnicities in the South Georgia at that point. It was all either black or white. And it was very interesting, you knew them. I mean, on our farm, I grew up on a farm, as you know. We had one African-American family that worked on the farm. I had children. My brother John and I played with Donald and Lorenzo, WB's boys, every afternoon. We played ball and did everything together and were pretty good friends. But at some point, all of a sudden you realize as a child that they were different. And you didn't know why. Mm-hmm. It's just cultural, and all of a sudden you still played with them after school, and you'd say hello to them on the street and stuff like that. But it was just a subconscious thing that happened at that point in the South, where you knew that these people that you played with at school, at home, in the afternoon, were somehow not the same people that you would associate with at school. Mm-hmm. Which is, you look back at now and you say that's a horrible thing, but that's the way the culture was.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to your question. So, and when I first started Americus High School, that was at the end of the Jim Crow era, when the philosophy there was separate but equal. So supposedly there were separate African-American schools and white schools, and supposedly they were equal, but in reality they were not, right. By any means. And so in my class, there was one black person, Broderick, his parents had chosen to send him to the white school because it was a better education than the black schools. He was fairly well ostracized for all 5 years of school, which is, looking back at it, I'm ashamed that I wasn't his friend.
Yeah. We kind of talked a little bit kind of on the way over here, but you kind of asked what do you remember about the civil rights movement?
Oh, that's a good question. In the early 60s in Americus, it was kind of like a mini Birmingham or a mini Montgomery. And this is not true just in Americus, but in small towns all throughout the South. So remember, I was in 62, I was 9, so I was 9, 10, 11 years old. And I can remember at that point when the African Americans, the black folks, tried to integrate the theaters, the restaurants, the bus station had segregated white and black areas, and they tried to integrate those. And they were, it's just somewhat a time of civil unrest. I can remember and that started, of course, they were refused to be seated there, and so they started an economic boycott. And so the African Americans would had their signs that they would carry around and walk around the city commercial center, which is only 4 blocks big. It's a small town. And they would walk around and, boycotting the white merchants until they were allowed to participate in the economic life of the town. And then one day I can remember, I forgot where we were coming from. My mom and my brother and I were driving home and had to stop because from the courthouse there were about 40 to 50 KKK Klans people that had come to counter-protest. And that was kind of weird and eerie. And I remember my mother just saying, boys, just be quiet, don't say a word, and it was strange because they were there in their full Klan regalia, and the thing about it was that although the African Americans were kind of boisterous in their protest, chanting and singing and that kind of things, the Klans people just marched down the street in complete silence. And it was kind of just an eerie feeling, they didn't say a word, didn't antagonize anybody. They knew that they're like the Klan throughout history, that their intimidation came through silence and power.
Yeah.
And it was a strange experience seeing that happen. So that lasted from 62 to 64. Each summer there were some kind of protest, and never any riots, never too much. Well, there was a murder in the midst of all that, a random killing that turned out not to be racially motivated. I think it was just some drunk person, riding around and shot somebody, and actually it was a white person that shot another white person in the town. I forgot the exact specifics, but generally we just knew during the summertime not to do our shopping downtown because, and again, as a boy, I didn't have any ideas of the historical significance of what was going on. It was just kind of strange, and I knew something was happening, but didn't know exactly what was happening.
Yeah. So how did that kind of play into school? Like, did those kind of tensions carry over into classrooms?
Yes, I wasn't quite in high school then. My older brother was 6 years older, so he was in high school when they immediately began to allow the first black folks to come to Americus High School, and there was a lot of tension around that. I've read stories and remember a little bit, that when the first African Americans drove up to go to the Americus High School, everybody was standing around throwing Coke bottles and yelling vulgarities and screaming at them, and I think the police had to escort them into the school, kind of just like, my name went blank, like what's his name, the University of Mississippi, but things settled down, and finally by the time I got there a few years later, there were probably somewhere between 1 to 4 African Americans in every class, and each class was probably like 130 people. So, a very small minority that had chosen to go to the white school. And as I said earlier, like Broderick, they were fairly well ostracized. They didn't participate in any sports. They didn't participate in any clubs or the social life. They were tolerated, but it must have been a very, very difficult life for them.
That's like, like flipping through the yearbooks earlier, kind of noticed because all the cheerleaders were white. There's like 3 or 4 people in the marching band that were black.
Right. Yeah, yes. Like I said, before my senior year was the year of full integration when they closed down the unequal black school system and it merged with the white school system. So my senior year was the first year when all the black teenagers came to the same high school that we went to. And that was a strange and difficult year. For example, I was on the annual staff to put together the annual. And the annual staff was always nominated or created the previous spring for the following school year. And so we were already established, and of course, we're an all-white group, and so I can remember like 2 weeks into school, the principal came into the annual staff meeting. We had a special class that was the annual staff, basically a journalism class, if you will. And the principal came in and said, look, we've got to allow some of the black students to join the annual staff because they had their own annual, of course, and so 5 or 6 black students kind of came in or then a part of the annual staff, and so it's kind of like it forced us to, whereas previously the black folks have been ostracized, now it forced us to talk to them, to work with them, and to find out, well, gee, these are people just like we are. So that was the beginning of a good change. It didn't help. Also, I should add that one of the black students was a phenomenal running back on the football team, and so when I think his name was Calvin Prince, he was like All-State for 2 or 3 years, and of course, there are a lot of stereotypes around this too, I know, but all of a sudden to have a young black man come in and be the star of the football team and take us to the region championship, that kind of made things go a little better too.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult, but if you could just try to make sure to not put your hands on the table.
Oh, gotcha. Boom, boom, boom. Thank you. Okay.
I'll take this opportunity to. Can you tell Andrew whether you had any conversations or you recall any conversations with your brother about what was the mood when that first year of integration was happening?
When the first integration started, my older brother was in high school. We never talked about it too much. Quite frankly, my brother's attitudes were he was much more in the redneck, for want of a better word, way of thinking than I was by the time I came along. So he was very anti having the black students come to school, very much, which is the predominant mood. He wasn't different in that regard, unfortunately. It was more difficult. I remember my mother moderated things a lot with my brother in their conversations.
Yeah. So how did Grandma approach it?
Oh, well, your mother was, like always, a shining light in the community. And one of my first memories of all this happening, and by this time it was probably 66, 67, and I just started going to the high school, or maybe I was going to the high school, and my mother was a teacher, as you know, and worked with the schools, and I remember one night looking at her, and she was reading a copy of a book called Why We Can't Wait by Martin Luther King Jr. And I said, Mom, why are you reading that book? And she says, well, Lewis, this is important. You have to understand that, a lot of things are changing in society, and Martin Luther King Jr. is a great man that's making things a lot better for a lot of people. And she was always full of compassion and always wanted to help people. And so she wasn't a raging liberal. She didn't march on the streets or anything like that, as you know, but she always showed an immense amount of support. And actually, as you know, finally in the last part of her life as educator, worked as a consultant for the Georgia State Department of Education before the years of full integration, going in to the African-American schools and working as a consultant to help them raise their standards and prepare for the integration that was come.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I knew she was a consultant. I didn't realize
that's what she did.
She was doing.
Yeah, they apparently at some point, the State Department of Education realized that the separate but equal system was not anywhere near equal. And so they actually devoted some resources to going and helping the African-American side of the systems, and hired these consultants like my mother to go in each region to go in and consult and try to help the principals and help the teachers and do a lot of in-service training and things like that.
Did you get a feeling kind of after integration from the African-American students, kind of how they felt about having to join in and mix in?
Yeah, I think there was a sense of loss in a way, unfortunately, because the local black high school, Staley High School, had a long tradition, and I think the African-American students, I have to confess I didn't know them having deep conversations with them about it, but I think they were somewhat frustrated, somewhat like, we had our own football team, now we don't, it's like like a corporate merger when you're the losing company, and you've been bought out by somebody else. It's like, you just kind of lose a lot of identity there. And for them to all of a sudden to go from being a Staley High School Tiger, I think there was, to an Americus High School Panther, was like, working for Microsoft and now having to go to work for IBM or something. It's just was a different experience for them. Yeah. And I think they felt very, quite a lot of them jumped in and played on the football team, the basketball team, joined the annual staff. A lot of them, I think, just kind of went to school. Of course, that may be true these days too. Just went to school without really trying to get involved.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, kind of outside, about the Key Club dance.
Oh yeah, that was one of the things that happened. Was they had the high schools, kind of like the TV show Friday Night Lights. It all revolved around football and social clubs. And the academics kind of was thrown in there a little bit too. That's not quite true, but but by senior year, they decided that we had to abolish social clubs because that might invite black folks and white kids associating with each other, which couldn't happen, of course. So my senior year, I was in the Key Club, which was like the Junior Kiwanis Club, a civic club, and my club decided that. Of course, one of the traditions was in the South and other places, you had a football game on Friday night, and after Friday night, you had a dance. And everybody went and danced till midnight, or not that late, probably 11:30, and then you went home if you were good boys and girls. If you weren't, you stayed out. So anyway, after the first football game, we realized there's not going to be a dance. So we were pretty hacked off about that because, that's what you did. You went to a dance after the football game. So we decided, I'm surprised they let us do this, but somehow they let us rent the county fair barn after the first football game. And so we rented the fair barn, and the Key Club sponsored a dance. And we invited everybody, black and white. And it was a good dance. Everybody came, had a good time. Nothing happened. Everybody went home. There weren't that many black people that came. I think some of the football players, because it was after the football team, and a handful of others came. Everything went fine. Everybody went home. That was Friday night. On Saturday, and I wasn't like the president of the club, but I was in the club. But on Saturday afternoon, we all got a phone call saying there was going to be a special club meeting on Sunday afternoon at somebody's house, actually. It wasn't at the school, but at somebody's house. So we said, okay. So we go to the special club meeting, and it's us. This was an all-boys club, the Key Club. Us and some of the girls, too. I guess they were the cheerleaders or somebody, some social standard. And they called us in with the county recreation director, Coach Finkley, an old retired football coach, who was a really sweet, wonderful man, to inform us that we couldn't do that anymore. That just wasn't appropriate for us to have dances after the football games, that it just wasn't a good thing. Americus just wasn't ready for that to happen yet. And so that was the end of the interracial dances after the football games. Yeah. So that's, an example of the kind of things that were going on.
Yeah. That and we kind of, you mentioned your senior year of the superlatives of not having.
Right. Yeah. Yes. When you look at the annual, always before in the senior year in the annual, there was the wittiest, the most likely to succeed, the most intellectual, Mr. and Mrs. AHS, all these superlatives, in my senior year, for whatever reason, and we never knew, even though I was on the annual staff, they decided that we were just going to have superlatives. We weren't going to have the wittiest or the most intellectual or something like that. We presumed that was because we didn't want to take the chance that, a black person might be the most intellectual, heaven forbid, So it was a strange time, indeed.
Yeah, I can imagine of kind of how did it feel like for this students, for the kids, like of wanting to do your own thing, of wanting to be yourselves, and having the powers that be kind of
not let you.
I feel like that'd be really frustrating.
Well, it was, although I have to say it was frustrating on one hand, not to be able to have dances at their football games. It was frustrating on one hand. On the other hand, we found ways around it, and we also, it was a little different than when you were growing up. I don't think we as teenagers felt as empowered, perhaps, as you did in the 90s, that, we were supposed to just do what our parents told us to do, which may or may not have been a good thing, depending on our parents. So you just did what your parents told you to do, and you kind of accepted authority perhaps more than you did 20 or 30 years later.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing, I should add.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Because I loved that you asked that question. Can you say whether, like, even if as teenagers you did what your parents said, was there discussion among students about this isn't right, or I wish something was different? Was there private dissent, and you can talk to each other?
Yeah.
That's a good question. There were conversations, I think dissent might be too strong a word, but there were private conversations where as we went through that year and had more association with more black folks, we realized that, you certainly realized that, hey, these folks aren't any different than we are, which you knew, I guess, in the back of your mind. But, quite frankly, you never had anything to do with black teenagers, as a white teenager until that happened. And so as the year went on, I think certainly those of us that were in school certainly learned to become more accepting. There's still so many stupid social standards or whatever, that, it was, it would have been inconceivable, almost inconceivable to think that a white teenager and a black teenager would date.
Yeah.
Certainly I'm sure it happened somewhere, but it was almost inconceivable that could happen, But still, you talked to each other, you began to understand. By the end of the year, I think, some friendships started to form, or at least some understanding. And interestingly, again, the primary role for that was through sports, because a lot of this small town was driven by sports. So, the black football players and the white football players got to go to the same locker room and shower together and, do whatever football players do. I wasn't one. Do whatever football players do in the locker room and got to know each other, or basketball and baseball. So, I think actually sports, was probably the most unifying element of the experience.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think kind of, is there kind of let me ask this one. Is there a defining moment kind of that stands out in kind of this push for, I don't know, push is the right word, but movement for desegregation, for anything that just stands out?
A defining moment, probably, I would say that I can't think of a single defining moment, but certainly the push slowly over the years from the 60s to the early 70s, every year, it's kind of like chipping away at a statue to finally get to something, whether it was all of a sudden the buses were integrated, the waiting rooms were integrated at the hospital, the separate wing of the hospital for African Americans was done away with, and it was like slowly but surely that social change occurred. Yeah. In terms of society, there wasn't a defining moment, I don't think, at least that I remember that happened. But it was a gradual change, I believe. I would say. Yeah.
What would you think, was there anything that surprised you most kind of about desegregation?
That's a good question. I think for most of us, it sounds almost silly to say, but I think the most surprising thing was all of a sudden you went from learning that black folks move from stereotypes to people. I mean,
Yeah.
when you grew up in the South or in any situation, in the South back then, now we have stereotypes of Latinos or, Muslims or whatever, and so, you learn that, that people aren't stereotypes, people are individuals, and as you start to interact with individuals, you learn more about humanity. And I'd say, that was probably the biggest change for most of us was realizing that, because once again, before full integration, the few black folks that were pretty much ostracized and you didn't interact with them.
Yeah.
But once you had that forced interaction, you begin to realize that people are people are people, and doesn't matter religion, color, skin, things like that, that people are people and they're good folks, they're bad folks, they're talented folks, they're not so talented folks, but people are just people.
Could you tell the difference between kind of how, I guess Uncle Johnny's class?
My younger brother?
Yeah, the younger brother versus,
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah, but John was 3 years younger than I was.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting. Two things happened there, two differences. Number one is, and this is throughout the South also, after we talk about white flight being white folks moving to the suburbs and interracial housing happening, but the other most significant white flight at that time and that age was the flight to segregation academies. So whereas in my class was probably 30% African American, 70% white, because that was pretty much reflected the demographics of the town. By the time my younger brother came along, so many of the white families had moved their kids to the segregation academy in town, Southland Academy. So at that point,
Interesting.
in his class 3 years later, it was probably 60% African American and 40% white. So there was that change, and the county next to us, Terrell County, actually. In my senior year, when desegregation occurred and full integration occurred, every white person in the county pulled out of the county's high school except for two white folks. They all went to the segregation academy. So that was another kind of weird thing happening down in the South then too. Was this huge rise of segregation academies and white people going there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that.
Oh yeah. In fact, one of the more interesting experiences of my senior year was. I wasn't on the basketball team, but some of my best friends were, and we went to Terrell County to the basketball game, and our team was probably 50-50 white-black folks, and their team was all black, and they were so proud of the fact that they were now, the black community that is, was so proud of the fact that they were the high school. They were Terrell County High School, and they owned it. They had an undefeated basketball team. They had a good basketball team. And we beat them in their gym, and they were mad, And actually, it was probably the most closest to a violent situation I was involved in. The coach ran over to us. There's probably about 10 or 12 of us sitting there, football players and me sitting there, and Coach Parrish came over to us and said, "You guys take the cheerleaders and get out of here."
Wow.
So we got the cheerleaders and kind of ran out of the gym with some rocks and things being thrown at us for beating their basketball team, and got in our cars and left as quick as we could. And I think the high school basketball team on their way out of town was pretty well pelted with Coke bottles and rocks all the way to the county line. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was kind of a weird kind of thing, but that was the underlying tension that was there.
Yeah.
And it was a little scary that night. We were glad to get home.
I bet.
So, yeah.
I imagine. I know it's been, a while since you've lived down in Americus.
Yeah.
But how do you feel things are? Do you have a sense of how things are now?
A little. Of course, we went back and visited along with
Yeah.
your grandmother lived down there before she moved here to Nashville with us. I still went down after that to visit some of her friends. I'd say change has occurred for the better, but certainly it's not there 100%. just like it's not 100% here in Nashville or in New York City or anywhere else.
Yeah.
It's still, in fact, in some cases, I think it's probably a little worse now, unfortunately, in terms of people's interactions. People want to go live in their gated communities and only associate with their homogenous group, which is so unfortunate. But things have changed. I mean, certainly, I mentioned earlier, it would be inconceivable for a white and a black kid to date. I don't think that's impossible now.
Yeah.
And certainly blacks are equally represented politically in the community and in the school systems. And the segregation academy is still there. I mean, there's still the hardcore folks that don't want to believe it. It's not 1940 anymore. But I think in general things have changed, although they're a long way from being perfect.
Yeah.
So.
I don't have any questions that are coming to mind right now. Is there anything that you would?
Yeah, I would share one thing that was possibly, you asked earlier if there was a significant turning point in terms of society, and I couldn't think of any significant things. But, I can think of certainly one episode personally that I look back at with some degree of shame. One of the issues that happened in the South was the push to integrate churches. Not to integrate churches, that's the wrong word, but at least to be open so that African American people could come to white churches and vice versa, and that was that was a difficult thing because most white churches, believe it or not, wouldn't allow black people to come to church, which, that just sounds stupid, not to allow a person to come to worship a house of God, whatever that God might be. And so sometime in the late 60s, I think this was I was a junior perhaps, maybe 69, there was a local college, Georgia Southwestern College, and the college coach, the coach of the baseball team went to our church, Lee Street Methodist Church, a small church there in town. And there was a visiting basketball team from up north. And again, this was as late as 68 or 69. A visiting baseball team from up north that was integrated, had some black players and white players, and they were there over the weekend, and Coach Knight invited them to come to our church. And when they came, the ushers wouldn't let them in, or wouldn't let the black players in. Absurd, totally absurd. And, the preacher, who was a good friend of our family, Reverend Roberts, was livid. My mother was even more livid. I mean, she was ready to, just raise all kind of hell.
Yeah.
And so I remember, shortly thereafter, there was an administrative board meeting, and it was a contentious, hot debate, and I look back at it and I think, how can you even have a debate about this, of course? But my mother and Reverend Roberts and some folks were adamant that, this was a horrible thing, and we needed to make an official policy to open our doors to make sure anybody could come to our church that wanted to.
Yeah.
And other people were just as adamant that, oh, no, we can't change, this is the way it ought to be, whatever, who knows what their arguments were. And Debbie Adkins and I were the two youth representatives on the administrative board. And we were sitting there listening to this debate, and we were 16 years old, 17 years old. We were good kids that did what our parents said we should do, My mother was strongly advocating that, we need to vote and change and make this policy to open the doors of the church.
Yeah.
Debbie's father, Mr. Adkins, was just as adamant that no, we shouldn't, that we need to keep the doors closed because that's the way it should be, that, churches were for white folks and the black folks had their own churches. And I don't know. So anyway, when it came down to a vote, very tense conversation, very tense debate. When it came down to a vote, the vote to open the doors of the church to anybody failed by one vote. And Debbie and I were so nervous, anxious, intimidated, whatever the word was, that even though we knew what was the right thing to do, we abstained and didn't vote. If we had voted, like our hearts told us to vote,
Yeah.
we would have opened the doors of the church to anybody.
Yeah.
I may not have ever told you that story. Probably that has led me to, thinking back on that, has led me to understand how important it is to open the doors of churches, of organizations, I don't care whether it's religion or not,
Yeah.
to anybody, regardless of their race, regardless of their sexual identity, regardless of who they are, what they believe, who they love, that's probably motivated me, which is a good thing, I guess, coming out of a bad, stupid inaction. So hopefully we'll learn from our mistakes, I guess, is what I'd say to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking that sounds a lot like the current issues in not just the Methodist Church, but that's
Oh, yeah.
what we're in, but of LGBTQ plus inclusion and
Exactly.
all that
Exactly.
crazy.
Exactly. I think it's motivated me and to work for inclusion for LGBTQ folks in all parts of life, or to work strongly to support immigrants, who come here in this country and just want to make a better life for themselves, and not that I've changed the world, because I surely hadn't done that, but it hopefully has helped me to try to, and Mary Kay, your mother, who shares those beliefs, to help try to influence you and your brother Michael to, be that way. And I'm proud to say I think it has worked. So,
I agree. I think so too.
yeah.
So, yeah. So, yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that, I'm looking at these closing questions, that seemed like a really good closing questions.
Well, thank you. I guess I would say that, Andrew, it makes me happy to see you. I mean, I think about the kind of a progression here. Like I said earlier, it was inconceivable for me to date a black person in high school. I just wouldn't think about it. When you were in high school, you dated a black girl.
Yeah.
Which is great. And my real hope is, I remember we had a conversation about that. You came to me and said, Dad, what do you think about would date a black girl? I said, fine with me, fine with your mom. And I hope when your children, Sophie and Elijah, come along, as they grow up, they don't even feel like they have to ask.
Yeah.
That's where I hope we'll be in another 10 years.
That's where I'm.
And thanks for being here with me today.
Yeah. It's been great. Thank you.
Do you have questions?
Possibly, but yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, going back to that story about the church was really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, you said your mom was so vocally and adamantly
Right.
against that, and did you, or for opening the doors,
Right.
Did you all have a discussion or conversation after that vote took place about that?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. We had a conversation with my mom. We got in the car and left, and my mom looked at me and says, why in the hell didn't you vote the way you should have? Well, yeah, why in the hell didn't you vote the way you should have? Which, for her to use profanity, is pretty significant, too.
I don't think I've ever heard her cuss.
Yeah, she was still a little on the angry side at that point, But and then she calmed down, and we had a conversation. I don't remember the specifics, about why it was so important, and why change was occurring, and we needed to accept it. And I mean, I don't remember specifics of the conversation. I remember her being angry at first, then I remember her, kind of apologizing and being angry at me.
I don't
having
think
a
I
conversation.
ever remember Grandma being
Angry.
It
didn't happen often. It didn't happen often, but it did happen some. Yes. Yeah.
And then just going back kind of a lot more, I guess, you mentioned that there was a student on the football team, a black student on the
Right.
football team who seemed like a football star.
A star.
and
Right,
turned
right.
your team around. I was wondering, how other students interacted with him, both like at games and then also just like in class and at school, and just kind of what that dynamic was like with him.
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, that there were, the star football players, a very good basketball player, David Brown, who was black. There were, some musicians that played in the band that were very, very good, African American, of course, and it was interesting that people started treating them with respect. You would say hello to them. You would interact with them. But, you wouldn't invite them to your house for, afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't think,
Was it kind of like, was it like two separate people? Like you had, at the games, you had the football player, it was great, and yeah, go. But then at school, it was kind of...
No, not really. It was very much two separate groups,
Yeah.
Which of course high school is always made up of groups or cliques, so it was still two separate groups. But there was some interaction amongst them,
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting at the games, as I remember, at the games, everybody kind of rallied around the football team, and it didn't matter if you were sitting next to a black person or a white person. It's not like the white people sat on one side of the stands and the black sat on the other,
Yeah.
which I always thought was kind of interesting, and
that was fine, but...
yeah, that was okay, but then you couldn't dance with them though.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was pretty well, around those events, it was pretty well integrated.
Yeah.
So, yeah.